This week, I sat down with ex-senior Green MP and current CEO of Forest and Bird, Kevin Hague. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as we did. If there's a guest you'd like to hear on a future podcast, or if you have any feedback for us, we'd love to hear it. Also, a quick shout out to Genocide for letting us use their track Wake Up, featuring Debt Collectors. You can find these guys on Facebook or download via iTunes.
Soldiers, don't give yourselves to brutes. Men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, and what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle, use you as cannon fodder. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men, machine men with machine minds and machine hearts. Yeah. You are not machines, you are not cattle, you are men.
Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. All the greed and the money got the government corrupt. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up.
So Kevin, thank you very much for sitting down with me and having a chat now. We're on the beautiful west coast of the South Island, and I've got to ask, how do you deal with all the rain?
Well, I guess, one of the things that people don't know about the West Coast generally is that for much of the year we don't have that much rain. So through winter, our typical day is, it's cool and crisp in the morning, and then we have these amazing clear blue skies through the day, and so winter's fantastic. Spring and autumn, I have to say, do tend to be a little on the damp side.
Pretty wet, yeah.
But actually, we don't get that much more rain than Auckland. We tend to get it in bursts.
Pretty
of a lot
heavy.
Of rain,
Yeah.
It's not raining right now.
No, you got a 5-minute gap.
Yeah.
I think that's why the nature's so beautiful here, is because of the high rainfall. It just brings everything to life.
Yeah, that's right. If you want rainforest, you've got to have rain.
Exactly.
Here we are sort of surrounded by bush at my place. What's enabled that to happen is all of the rain. So
Yeah. No, beautiful. So Kevin, obviously you're ex-Green MP, now working for Forest Bird. Tell us a little bit about how you first got into politics and why you chose the Green Party.
Well, I mean, I'd been involved in political issues for, since I was a kid. So environmental issues, human rights issues, gay rights, anti-apartheid movement, the movement of Pākehā trying to honour the treaty, sort of men against sexism, lots and lots of different things.
Yep.
And I guess what I was seeing was that I was a person who had a lot of skills around the political process. I'd sort of worked for a lot of community organisations, usually in a voluntary capacity, trying to influence public policy, trying to influence law, trying to influence the political process. So I knew pretty strongly how it worked, and a person with pretty strong values and motivation to try and change things. And so I thought that I could probably add value to the Greens in Parliament. And the thing that the thing that made me think, okay, it's sort of now or never, was back in 2008, was climate change. Really, so one of my degrees has been in geophysics, atmospheric and oceanic physics. So I've considered that doing something effective about climate change was an urgent priority for New Zealand, and I thought that Parliament would be the opportunity for me to do that. As it turned out, that was never my portfolio.
Yeah.
But I did a lot of things in areas that I thought were pretty useful: conservation, health. Those are my main portfolios over the years. Yeah.
Very crucial things, especially in New Zealand at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and that plays in pretty nicely into the new role into Forest and Bird as well. So we'll touch on that after.
Yeah.
So with the Green Party, how effective do you think it is? I mean, obviously the Green Party's been opposition for the last 9 years, and there's not much that you can actually do in opposition. A lot of it is just, sort of wailing on the government for everything they're doing wrong, but then not actually being able to implement any change yourself until you get back into power. So how was that as an MP in opposition?
Yeah, well, I have to say, so I did 8 years in opposition, and that was pretty hard yakka, So most of the arguments or discussions that you have in your working day, you end up on the losing side of, and that's pretty dispiriting. However, what I would say is, that we were able to actually make some gains. It's just that the gains that you make are always contingent on being able to persuade someone else. So, there's literally hundreds of thousands of New Zealand houses that are insulated now because of the Green Party, and the Green Party persuaded first Labour and then National, that this was a sensible use of public dollars. So, I'm proud of that. And things that I worked on, I worked as one of the co-sponsors of Ngā Haerenga, which is the New Zealand Cycle Trail Network. So, John Key had the money, and the government of the day had the idea to build in fact, their plan was for a concrete ribbon that would go from North Cape to Bluff. And we kind of went along to them, and to their credit, that we said, great idea that you've got money for cycle trails. That's actually maybe not the best use of that money. How about this idea of a network? And to their credit, they could see the value in what we were saying, and understood that we had expertise they didn't have.
Yep.
And resetting traps, in the conservation space. Sure. That was a Green Party initiative. We persuaded the government that they should put money into large-scale trials of resetting traps. Sure enough, they did, and the traps have come on in leaps and bounds as a result of that process. And we're now able to use them in lots of places to gain effective, particularly rat and possum control.
For sure, which is more than needed at the moment with their
absolutely
expanding levels and pests in New Zealand.
Yeah, so there definitely were areas where I was able to kind of persuade National or other parties, of the validity and the worth of our arguments. But most of that progress was in the first 3 years. And after that point, National, you could almost see a political switch flicking where they said, okay, so the political gains that we've got from working with the Greens and showing that we're not, just environmental vandals, we've got now, so we don't need to do anything more with them. And so after that first 3 years, it was really hard to actually persuade them of anything new.
And especially with political cycles as well, once they're in, it's sort of a bit harder to, as we're seeing now getting closer to election time, now they're starting to act on some of these things which they've left ignored for a number of years now. Yeah,
sadly,
Yeah. And then another thing that you did, which was really positive in the political sphere, was the marriage equality work that you did.
Yeah. I'm proud of a lot of what I did in Parliament. Marriage equality, I loved that as a campaign. So Lewis Awall and I both had bills in the ballot. If I'd been asked to identify what's the most important issue for gay people, it wouldn't have been marriage equality. I would have identified, because I think the much higher priority is creating a safe environment for our young people, for example. But Barack Obama got asked whether he supported gay people being able to marry. He said yes. And because John Key wanted to be Barack Obama's bestie,
play golf.
He got asked about it as well, and he couldn't really give an answer that was different to Barack Obama. So he said, "Well, yeah, I'd support it, but I don't detect a clamour." And so Louisa and I both thought, "Aha, here's an opportunity."
There we go. Yep.
So we went about creating a clamour, and so we both drafted bills. We agreed that whoever's didn't get pulled first would support the other.
Yep. Excellent.
And sure enough, Lewis's bill got pulled the first week that it was in the ballot, which is amazing.
Pretty amazing, yeah.
And we worked really well together alongside National Party MPs. Tauhinara, Nikki Kay. They were sort of really important in our process, but. As an old political strategist, what I really liked is that the strategy that I developed kind of just worked perfectly.
Yep.
Yeah, and so it was, you know, it's been great to see the positive impact that's had.
And what sort of strategy was that to try and get as many people on board as possible?
Yeah, so we set out for the, I mean, essentially what I was concerned about, I knew that having the Prime Minister supporting the initiative would give the green light to a whole lot of backbenchers that would support it but were anxious. So that was crucial. And then what I wanted to do was create a sense of inevitability. So we went really hard out to get the very best result we could for the first reading. We had good information about where MPs stood, and we had people who would be effective messengers for those MPs to go and see them to actually shore up their support or to persuade them of the case. And we worked to kind of neutralise the arguments. Kind of overstates the case, but the things that opponents of the bill said. So sort of demonstrated that they were nonsense, and also really targeted the thing that we knew would be the cause of the greatest anxiety for MPs who are electorate MPs who were anxious that their electorate wouldn't support them. Because it's one of those things where MPs will tend to lag public opinion, and they'll assume that the public opinion is more conservative than it really is. But what we were able to show was that in equivalent votes like homosexual law reform, civil unions, the changes to the Human Rights Act, you know, that actually those MPs who'd been strongly supportive of progressive change actually had done better at the ballot box than those who'd been equivocal or who were opposed.
Which makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because I mean, if that's where public opinion is, then of course that's, you know, going to benefit them in the long run. Yeah.
And I guess the other thing that we did was, I mean, we did encourage a lot of submissions on the bill, but what we said to people who wanted to make submissions is, you know, within the first 10 submissions that we read, we will have heard pretty much all of the arguments. So don't give us arguments, don't give us evidence. Tell us your story. Tell us why this is personally important to you. And so that's what people did, and it was really effective.
Wow. Yep. And that's something we can take forward going for all sort of new movements, and that is that sort of...
Yeah, I think so. You know, I think you know, of course it's important to actually have the arguments on the table. But when you're trying to influence a select committee, just restating the same thing again and again and again actually is kind of really not that useful.
Yeah.
So you need to have the arguments, you need to have the evidence presented as well as it can be. But rather than focus on just a whole heap of form submissions, which is, I guess, what a lot of groups tend to do, a much smarter thing is to really put the emphasis on getting people to tell their personal story, to actually allow emotion and values to actually come into what they're presenting to MPs, because that's the thing that will get cut through. So MPs that have, you know, literally thousands of submissions on an issue, well, you know, it's pretty hard going to read all of them or hear all of them, and essentially, you know, the person in front of you is not saying anything different to the last 20 people that you've heard.
Sure.
But if that person is telling you something about them, about their life, about what's important to them, well, you pay attention, because that creates the variety and the richness. So I focus on that quality rather than quantity.
Excellent. I guess that sort of goes against the copy-paste sort of style, which a lot of these campaigns use in their submission formats.
Absolutely. I mean, over the years, I've, you know, sort of campaigned on many different issues and advised lots of groups on campaigning style. And one of the things that I believe very, very strongly is that we still have lots of groups that really don't do strategy. They have tactics. So the tactics of march, rally, petition, you know, like pretty standard set of things, and they throw those tactics at whatever the issue is. And actually, that's occasionally they'll end up being the right tactics, but more often than not, they'll be the wrong ones. So what I say to people is, put a lot of work into sort of defining what success looks like, figure out what decision or action will bring about that success, who will do that, who is the person who ultimately will make the decision that you need. And it might be one person, it might be multiple people. What are all of the influences and influencers on that person? So what will cause them to make the decision that you need? And take into account the formal stuff, like this is what the law says they have to take into account. This is what their officials will be saying. But also the informal stuff, what will their neighbours or family be saying? What do they think that public opinion is about this issue? And then working backwards in that way, you then develop a bit of a work program for, okay, so these are the things that we need to do to be able to bring about the result that we need.
Powerful. I think a lot of people should take note, myself included, because our traditional format is exactly that, sort of drum up support online, get people to hit the streets and protest, make a lot of noise and try and get politicians involved, but that's sort of as far as that sort of side goes. And the next step is to try and find a style which actually works and then can get those movements into action.
I think, in some ways... So our access to kind of electronic media, it's a double-edged sword. So it gives us sort of way better access into people's, kind of living rooms and offices, and actually enables us to communicate with them better. But in terms of getting them to take action, the kind of action that we tend to see as kind of collectivism, where people think, yes, I'll like that, or yes, I will share that on my page, or I'll say I'm going to that Facebook event, and the truth is that that's getting sort of not that much cut through, and so what we need to figure out a way of doing is using the access that Facebook and Twitter and so on give us, but using it to actually get people to engage in the real world.
Totally, because I mean, likes and shares don't really mean change, do they?
No, they don't.
And we find that ourselves, that we can share lots of content that can share like wildfire on social media, but then getting people to rallies, to protests, or getting people to public meetings or community meetings, those sort of things, is much harder.
Yeah.
And I mean, it makes sense because you can sit behind a keyboard and say things very easily, but then to go out and show face, and then people are concerned about public image, or if it may affect their employment, or there's all those sort of things to be taken into account as well. So we've got to show people that you can still do more than just sit behind a computer and hit a like button and think that that's your work done towards an issue.
I think that's exactly right. Having been involved in, particularly the movement against the Springbok tour in 1981, where we had, literally hundreds of thousands of people in the streets marching and taking direct action. That couldn't be ignored. We need to find a way of creating that same environment where people feel that they really don't have a choice. If they're opposed to something, or if they want a particular outcome to be achieved, it's that sort of action that they need to take.
And that was all before social media as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a slow burn, but I sometimes say this to people around climate change, because I do come across a lot of people who are really dispirited about our potential to actually get people taking meaningful action on climate change. But in 1980, towards the end of 1980, the rugby union had already invited the South Africans, apartheid South Africans, to tour New Zealand. So this was already a live issue. There was a meeting of the Rugby Union Council, and I reckon we probably had 20 people on a picket. Pretty hopeless.
Yeah.
but we were able to actually kind of relentlessly force the issue so that people kind of had to take a stand. You know, they were either opposed to the tour and doing something about it, or else they were at least tacitly supporting, you know, apartheid South Africa.
And how did you get that across?
I wish I could remember.
It was a few years ago now, wasn't
So long ago, yeah.
And John Key's forgotten whether he supported it or not.
I'm pretty clear which side I was on.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I mean, we were helped by the kind of the rhetoric of the Prime Minister of the day, Robert Muldoon, you know, because so we were communicating using sort of community-based media, like actually talking to people and putting ads in newspapers sometimes, community hall meetings, you know, those sorts of things, petitions, you know, and you know, the Prime Minister of the day obviously had better access to communication channels, but he would say things that were so extreme, you know, that actually it forced polarisation. So you know, so people were needing to make a choice. So I think that's useful. I mean, but then the problem I've seen is that people then thinking, okay, those mass movement tactics are the ones that are most effective. Well, you know, the problem is if you use mass movement tactics and you don't actually have a mass movement, what that says to decision makers is, oh, well, I can safely ignore that.
Which is what's been happening in the last how many years of National. Yeah, and so, I mean, I think there are exceptions, you know. So when we ran the campaign in 2009, I guess it was, on National's proposal to allow mining in some of the highest value conservation areas, so national parks and sort of high value conservation parks and so on, we were able to do the same thing. We were kind of able to tap into people's kind of, I guess, deep love of nature and deep sense that it should be protected. So what National was proposing was a real affront to that, and in that case we did use particularly Facebook as an organising tool, but we also did a lot of old style things. You know, we actually did have a coalition of organisations that were kind of meeting regularly in an old style way and organising. Okay, well, this is going to be our day of action when we have coordinated marches in the streets and that sort of thing. So I guess what that shows is that it's possible to meld both things. And, you know, the Forest and Bird's certainly going to be looking to do exactly that kind of thing. Excellent. So what issues like climate change, issues like freshwater quality in New Zealand, how do we mobilise people? How do we get people to get out there and create change? What do you think the best tactic is?
Yeah, well, I think so. I can tell you right now that on freshwater, Forest and Bird is part of a coalition of community-based organisations that is looking to exactly how we can organise that kind of campaign.
Excellent.
So over the coming months, people are going to see a whole lot more of us raising the profile of the issues, giving people the opportunity to connect meaningfully with a whole lot of other people, because we know that the community is, you know, really angry about the state of our freshwater and wants to be able to take meaningful action. So we need to present what meaningful action looks like in a way that isn't just a whole lot of
standard format.
And that isn't confusing science. You know, because actually, sort of getting into a debate about the science is exactly what the status quo wants. And
we are seeing a lot of that. Like the mainstream media has been pretty good at covering a lot of these issues and giving scientists like Mike Joy, Alison Dews, you know, the limelight to actually explain the issues that we have and, you know, what is contributing factors towards this degradation of our waterways.
I think that's exactly right. So there's a guy from Lincoln University, Ken Huey, who's been part of an ongoing kind of surveillance program of public attitudes on conservation and environmental issues. And really, the one issue that has got really substantial cut through with the public is freshwater quality.
For sure.
And I guess that's a combination of what people observe themselves, so those of us who live in rural areas, or perhaps work in rural areas, are aware of the degradation of waterways. You've spoken with Sam Mann, and Sam
Lived right on the doorstep of it.
Absolutely, he's been a real hero for this movement. So there's kind of direct observation, but also, we have been successful in getting media interest in freshwater issues. And so we're seeing more and more effective stories about that, which is getting into the living rooms of people who live in the cities that maybe are, would never otherwise actually know what was going on.
Oh, look at the Sunday, the last 2 weeks on Sunday. Did you see those?
Yeah.
And how much debate and discussion that has created around dairy farming and the impact it's having.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, some listeners will be old enough to remember the Save Manapori campaign. But that was a lake in Fiordland, a remote part of New Zealand that most New Zealanders have never been to, and probably never will go to. So they've never seen it for themselves. But the success of the campaign was effectively bringing the lake to their living rooms and getting them to care about this place. Because people actually thought, well, even though I've never been there, I care that this beautiful place exists and is protected. I don't want to see it degraded. We did a similar thing with the Save the Mukihinui campaign, which is a river here on the west coast, just north of Westport there. Most people, will never have seen it. So what we did was tour films about the river around the country and got people to understand what was at stake.
Excellent. So what do you think some of the things are which we need to do? I mean, obviously dairy is having a massive impact and there's been a lot of focus on what the problem is, and I don't think there's been as much focus on what the solutions are.
Yeah.
Do you think it's time that we start having a solution-based approach to these issues rather than just repeating again and again what the problems are?
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, it's interesting because it may be that we couldn't actually move out of this phase until now, because until very recently indeed, there was still a whole lot of people saying there's no real problem. And so it was essential that we continued to sort of be relentless about establishing that indeed there is a massive problem, and nobody now really disputes that. So I think we now are in a space that allows for debate about solutions. Unfortunately, the only solutions that are going to be really meaningful and really tackle the problem are ones that involve pretty major change in land use. So, like at a bare minimum, we need to stop further intensification of dairy farming, basically. And that's a direct challenge to the model that the dairy industry has been using.
Because they want to almost double production and.
Well, you think about Fonterra, one of the world's largest dairy companies, and certainly one of New Zealand's largest companies. Its model actually is about volume. It's about volume with very little value add. And despite what they say, that's how everything goes. So they have a massive commercial interest behind further intensification. How much milk could you possibly extract? From that piece of land, and so they will fight, taking into account externalities like till the very end, and they will do whatever they can, in fact, to resist moves to de-intensify. But that's precisely what we have got to do. We're speaking in a week that Sir Peter Gluckman's just published a report as the government's chief science advisor,
which is massive. Yeah.
It's the report is really important in the sense that it will kind of lay to rest a lot of the dispute about the science, but it still is faint-hearted in terms of solutions because it's kind of saying, well, a bit more riparian planting.
Which isn't the solution, is it? If
Sure
you
isn't.
heard Mike Joy speaking, I think it was on Radio NZ, saying that it's not the riparian planting or getting stock out of the waterways which is the main issue. It's the intensity on the farms and the nitrates which are seeping down through the soil, not just off the side into streams.
That's exactly right. Obviously, if you can get stock out of waterways and if you can ameliorate some of the impacts by riparian planting, well, you would do that rather than doing nothing. But in terms of confronting what's actually driving this problem and will make it much worse in the future, we just simply have to address intensity of land use.
Yeah, it's the elephant in the room, isn't it? And I think that's what's being addressed now.
I mean, I think, I'm hugely excited by Alison Dew's work because what she is showing is that for many farmers, not Fonterra, but for the farmers themselves, their profitability can be maintained or even enhanced,
increased with
lower intensity farming methods.
Because you don't
have
fewer
stock, less fertiliser.
Yeah, and we need to go back to that traditional model, which is then more sustainable, not only for their business but for the environment as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you been following the Environment Canterbury lack of democracy and all the pro-farming crap going on there?
Yeah, perhaps not as closely as I should have been, but I for I think I spoke at a rally in Christchurch immediately after after democracy was suspended, I've been a long-term supporter of the view that the suspension of democracy was actually about a group of people as the Environment Canterbury councillors who were actually starting to get to grips with some of the solutions. And of course that wasn't very convenient.
Not the business model that they want.
Yeah, exactly.
There.
Yeah, so the two things are entirely caught up with each other, and the Sunday programs piece on the Selwyn River, I think, is fantastic. That was a great piece of reporting that actually again brings those Canterbury issues into people's lounges right around the country.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting you say that about the division between the prior ECAN board and looking at what we have now. I read an article today where I think his name's Alan Lim, he's the chair of the Canterbury Water Strategy Board, who's saying that currently now there is more division in the ECAN board because of the democratically elected councillors like Lan Farm, who's come on board, and now she's starting to challenge all the government selected councillors who are all very pro-farming. There's no issue, we're doing our riparian planting and we'll leave it at that. And he's saying, well, look, we're getting back to this, complete disputes. But I mean, isn't that the job of democratically elected councillors to come in and actually represent the people? Because Lan was the most voted for person in the local democracies.
Absolutely. So successive governments, in fact, have been at a central level, have really failed. So you think about the Resource Management Act. The intent at the time that was passed was that there would be a whole lot of national policy statements where national bottom lines were put into effect. And really, successive governments have failed to do that. Actually, the current government has done more in the way of national policy statements than its predecessors. But in that environment, it means that regional government becomes incredibly important because it's entirely up to them to set the bottom lines, and that's precisely the role that they have is to actually sort of be that thin green line in effect between unregulated industry and protecting the environment.
You can see it's sort of merged in Environment Canterbury at the moment, where you've got the farmers, the fox guarding the hen house at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. There's an interesting debate within businesses about ought business to have social and environmental objectives as well as just profitability. Yeah. And certainly there are companies. There's the natural step, and there's triple bottom line. There are businesses who actually do see themselves as having some responsibilities independent of what the framework or rules are that they'll have to operate in. But the bulk of businesses actually say, well, our job is purely about profit maximisation, and so the way to do that is to push what we do to the limits that are set by regulators, and that happens around environmental issues and around social issues. So unless government sets sort of decent limits, both at a national level and a regional level, well, it should expect that businesses will operate right up to the limit, and if there is no limit, then they're going to occupy a space that should be completely
natural business incentive.
Yeah.
Interesting. So I want to change tack a bit and talk a bit about climate change. It's quite interesting to see how many people still deny the fact that human activity is having an impact on our environment.
Yeah.
Where does Forest and Bird stand on climate change, and what sort of policies or what sort of strategy does Forest and Bird have to introduce proper action on climate change?
So Forest and Bird, for probably 4 or 5 years, certainly preceding me, the Forest and Bird has identified climate change as one of the major issues that represents threat to nature in New Zealand. So our job is to give nature a voice, to restore and protect nature. And I guess we've been, to some extent, figuring out kind of what our particular role is. What is the thing that we can bring to climate change that perhaps others can't. And so what we've tended to focus on has been what are the effects of climate change on our natural environment, on sort of these native species that we love, and our ability to restore and protect nature, and how can we use our role as arguably New Zealand's sort of preeminent conservation organisation, in the same way that the Sierra Club maybe has done in the States, to lead public opinion. So we've done a lot of work internally, sort of getting our branches around the country. We've got sort of 50 branches around the country to identify climate change as one of the key issues that they want to work on. And we've been saying the three big issues that pose a threat to nature in New Zealand are habitat loss, pests, and climate change. And climate change actually underpins both of those others as well, because it actually contributes to habitat loss and to pests. So we've been working to a 3-year program that is about raising awareness of our branches, getting them to start doing stuff at a local level, trying to take opportunities to raise climate change as an issue in the context of conservation debates. And sort of we're an active participant in the groups that are trying to support Generation Zero in their Climate Act campaign. We think that's a great initiative.
For sure.
So there's a bunch of stuff that we have been doing. It'll feature in our election campaign this year. So what we're saying is to New Zealanders, what we're trying to do. So it's interesting. So New Zealanders say that nature is personally very important to them at a rate of about 85-90%. So the vast majority of people give that a really high priority. But when Roy Morgan, the polling company, which does a whole lot of political polls, asked people what is the most important issue facing New Zealand, which of course is closely linked to how people vote, the combined total for environmental issues, conservation, climate change, and natural disasters in October last year was 4%. 4% of people said that one of those things was the most important.
Wow.
So how do you reconcile, this really high importance to nature with such a low priority? Because at 4%, what happens is politicians say, okay, so I can safely ignore that issue. It's like the minister looks out of their beehive office and sees that there's, 20 people have come on the, march to Parliament about, some issue. They say, okay, I'm safe. I can completely forget about that. Yeah. So we've been doing some work into how can we raise that 4%? Because we need to raise the priority that people give to these issues so that politicians are forced to respond. And we think that what's going wrong is that while people think looking after nature is very important, they also tend to think things are kind of under control. So on conservation, they see the conservation stories they see on the TV news are, record number of kakapo chicks, in breeding program, or riflemen being released into an area that they weren't in previously. So they see conservation success stories, plus all of those sort of beautiful images of intact environments that we use to market everything, from tourism to milk powder.
To Fonterra ads.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So on the conservation front, that's what's happening. And I think on climate change, they've had governments that have done so little and had a rhetoric around, New Zealand is doing its share in the world, that people kind of think that that's what's going on. Now, people who've travelled extensively will know that you go to pretty much any other country and actually there's an enormous amount going on around climate change that we don't have going on in New Zealand. But because we're kind of isolated at the end of the world, if people haven't travelled, if they're getting their understanding of how we're doing from the news or from what politicians say, well, it's kind of understandable that they think it's kind of okay. We're on track. We're doing our bit. We're leading this agricultural research program. For sure. So those are the kinds of things that we need to break. These sort of folk tales about New Zealand's doing okay.
Yeah. And do we do that through spreading awareness and education on a lot of these topics?
Yeah, so some people will have seen more of that from Forest and Bird this year. That some of the issues that we've picked up. So, say the proposed mine at Tukuha near Westport, proposed new coal mine. So we've been saying both wrong place for a mine, but also, by the way, we can't afford to be mining. So we're sort of raising those issues, and at a bare minimum, New Zealand needs to be stopping coal mining, and moving away from fossil fuel dependency where it's easy to do that. We gave a decent push to the recent OECD report on the state of the environment in New Zealand, which identified emissions, identified New Zealand as the absolute laggard in the OECD when it comes to climate change, and points up some really easy win areas, such as in transport. Goodness only knows how many photo opportunities Simon Bridges has had around electric cars, quite a few. Yep. Without there actually being any substantive policy about that at all. We will be working with other organisations this year to actually to try and break that folklore, but at the same time kind of saying there's a whole lot of things that governments could be doing. So we are putting the acid on political parties to make commitments to do those things.
That's awesome. I think another issue which isn't really that targeted is in New Zealand, 48% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture.
Yeah.
And yet we see that farming isn't included in the emissions trading scheme. Is that something that needs to change?
Yes. I mean, OECD says farming has to be in the ETS. You couldn't disagree.
It's hard. Yeah.
I mean, sure, farmers are going to say, "Oh, it's really hard for us," but on the other hand, unless you put farming in the ETS, what incentive is there to actually change? The climate doesn't care that it's hard for people to make changes.
Exactly.
And we've got to keep our eyes on the prize, and that's, we have simply got to, as rapidly as possible, decarbonise our economy. And I'm afraid that applies to agriculture as much as to everything else.
It's the same argument with cleaning up waterways, and that a lot of the farmers say, and I think it was the Mike Joy and Russell Death report, which said that if the cost of cleaning up the waterways and the pollution to the environment was factored into the business model, dairy farmers wouldn't have a model to work with.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so there is a model of public policy. So a political party could, as its policy commitment, say we're going to ensure that the costs that of activity like farming that are currently externalised, so not actually sort of met from within the industry, and met by the public instead, are instead internalised. Now the problem with that is it will probably take a while to do, and actually we don't really have a while,
No, we don't.
So I don't tend to favour that as at least the frontline solution. I just think we need politicians who are prepared to make some bold changes. And think about the fact we were talking about Alison Dew's work before. So if you de-intensified in a smart way, you'd actually sort of relieve some of the pressure on fresh water, and you'd reduce the emissions from agriculture. Well, isn't that quite a good thing to do?
Isn't it? It's definitely a model which farmers should at least be looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, the other thing, I mean, the very fastest thing that we can do in New Zealand to reduce our net carbon emissions is increase pest control. Because if you can actually knock out possums, then that's an enormous amount of biomass in trees that is saved literally every night.
Wow.
And that means that the trees are able to take up and sequester a whole lot more of the carbon. And by the way, native trees are a hell of a lot better at sequestering carbon than pine trees are.
Isn't it? Manuka and Kanuka, some of the biggest.
Yeah, well, so Manuka and Kanuka, I mean, because they're fast growing, they do a whole lot. And then, of course, you can have, Manuka honey industry that goes with, there's a whole lot of
benefits,
co-benefits.
Yep.
But actually, even trees that are slower growing, like podocarps, one of the things about native trees is that they continue to sequester carbon through the term of their life. They don't stop sequestering as pine trees do. So it's a way of really permanently sort of removing carbon, or at least for hundreds of years. That's a pretty useful contribution that you could make almost overnight.
And it's interesting, the same argument in regards to the pollution in the environment is the first step should be stop putting the pollution there in the first place. Before we start addressing it seriously, we need to stop emitting so much pollution. And it's the same thing with, the CO2 emissions in New Zealand. We need to start addressing it. And what do we see from the national government? More oil drilling, more mining, the complete opposite of the COP21 agreement guidelines, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And it's another reason why people are confused, you know, because the kind of the faintness and incoherence of government action makes them think that this can't be as serious an issue after all as maybe some people were saying. You know, because otherwise, you know, how could you have more oil exploration? You know, as we know, and I'm sure sort of your listeners will know, there is already, you know, we can't afford to burn the oil and coal that we've already discovered, let alone discovering more. And I mean, right now, you know, we've got the Amazon Warrior, what an ironic name that is, you know, this sort of massive oil exploration ship off the coast of New Zealand looking for oil in depths of water that are twice the depth where the Deepwater Horizon oil well blew out, which, by the way, was so deep that no one really knew how to shut off the blown out wellhead. So, you know, this is an extreme kind of oil exploration. So why on earth would we be doing that? You know, there's just no coherent reason at all.
And there's so much risk borne by us as New Zealanders. And the other thing is we don't have the capability to deal with if there was a big spill.
I've been touring around the country, but talking about Forest and Birds priorities, but also introducing myself to groups of people who I maybe haven't met before. And I usually start by saying that I became a conservationist on my 7th birthday. And I'm able to be really precise about that because my birthday in 1967 was the day that the first major oil tanker spill occurred. And that was a ship called the Torrey Canyon that ran aground on rocks off the south coast of England, where I lived at the time. And the beaches that I used to go to in Cornwall and Devon, you know, for my summer holidays, were coated in oil. And so those were the first images of seabirds, you know, dying from being completely befouled by oil. And it's interesting, when I went to Tauranga to be part of the Rena cleanup, there's a particular smell of oil and seawater, you know, that just sent me back to my childhood, back to those beaches in England. You know, it is such a devastating thing. You know, like it destroys ecosystems
Completely.
Why on earth would we be taking that risk? You know, from the oil company's point of view, potentially there's privatised profit and the risk is socialised.
Exactly.
Well, you know,
what do we get?
What's
from
the downside?
Yeah.
But from our point of view, like it's just pathetic.
It was great to see Russell Norman out there on the front of the fight, jumping in front, and isn't it interesting to see that the Anadarko amendment, him being prosecuted by the Ministry of Oil, not by New Zealand Police. Yeah,
that's right, and it's, you know, so we for mining proposals on conservation land now, it used to be the Minister of Conservation that effectively, in the end, you know, had to make a decision about whether or not this application was consistent with the conservation values that a place was being held in the conservation estate for. That is now a joint decision of the Minister of Conservation and the Minister of Energy and Resources, who, by the way, happens to be a much more senior cabinet minister. You know, so it's. And I've talked a lot about this thing where I think that we have had a succession of governments who have tended to see the environment as largely a kind of set of resources to be used by the economy.
Sure.
Either they're the raw materials or they're the waste disposal for economic activity. It's that people who study stage one economics, the theory of the firm, these are inputs into the firm. Now, actually, that suggests an idea of economics as if the economy was some kind of immutable natural force.
Environment wasn't at risk for.
But it's simply not the case. The economy is actually a set of arrangements that human beings have designed to achieve a particular thing. The particular thing is the enrichment of a relatively few people at the cost of the environment and the many. So we can, as human beings, choose to set up an economy that does something else. And we are now, as the OECD correctly states, we now have economic activity that is against the limits of the environment. So if you want more economic activity, you actually have to delink it from resource use, and that means a fundamentally different kind of economy.
But it doesn't make sense because the benefits that our economy could gain by investing in green renewable technologies is going to be far greater than the subsidies or the benefit from subsidies for oil drilling and, for fossil fuel exploration. I mean, especially over here on the West Coast, it's been hit particularly hard by the downturn in mining, obviously Pike River, issues like this.
Yeah.
We need to be reinvesting money into these sort of regions, into renewable technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been an ongoing conversation that I've been in since we arrived on the coast in 2003. What we have here on the coast, and I think this is a bit of a microcosm for New Zealand as a whole, is a bit of a clash of values and worldviews. We still have a significant group of people who are invested in what I refer to as an extractive mentality, who they kind of believe that the future will be sort of like the past. And, up until fairly recently, that wasn't an unreasonable kind of assumption. It has served people kind of well to assume that the sorts of things that maybe they were doing in the past would be the same sorts of things, unless you happen to be in, the wrong industry, I don't know, sort of the gaslight industry or the horse and buggy industry or something like that.
You're not going to last long.
But things have changed, and on the West Coast now, there's a substantial group of people who understand that the economy has got to be different. So the economy cannot be, dig stuff up, cut stuff down, extract it. It's got to be about adding value and quality to raw materials, if you like. And actually, if you can have an entirely weightless product, that's better still, because you don't have to pay anything to freight it somewhere. And so, I know that there are, the ground has been shifting here. So until very recently, people like Tony Cockshorn, who's the mayor of the Grey District, there's an economic downturn, right? Well, we need to start a new mine. That would be the response. Tony, to his great credit, has been changing his mind about that. So he spoke last year at the Environment Defence Society conference, and one of the things he's now been saying publicly is mining is not the future economy for the West Coast. Our future is a diverse economy in which looking after the environment is the bottom line for everything.
For sure.
So that's for me, that's a really positive emblem of the shift in thinking. Now, there's still a whole lot of people who think that a new mine or the road from Haas to Hollyford, or extracting fresh water and shipping it off to some other country,
right, for the Kiwi sanctuary.
Yeah, those sorts of ideas are still going to crop up, but those are people whose ideas are really stuck in the past. And there's this growing group of people who are saying, okay, how do we do tourism, for example, in a way that is very high value add. You know, so that we're having minimum and manageable impacts on the environment, but still collecting the dollars. So cycle trails actually are a pretty good example of that kind of thing. There's a group of people here in Greymouth who are doing robotics and software design.
Wow.
Well, let's have more of that.
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the world that's
Exactly.
where we're
Yeah.
moving.
You know, so what we need is some more people in positions of authority who are going to be encouraging that new economy. And I think that the old one will die a pretty rapid death. But you know, here's the other part of that, and sort of relates to your question. There are benefits of that change. There are also costs of the change. You know, so I'm a firm believer in just transitions. You know, so that where there is a collective societal interest in particular industries being transitioned out of, well, let's actually share the cost of that collectively. There is a bit of a model for that on the West Coast. You know, when native logging was stopped, there was, you know, a transition fund that was set up with Development West Coast. It's just been a bit non-strategic. I'd like to see some more strategic use of that fund, and perhaps topped up with some money that's about, okay, we won't do the mining anymore either. So I like that idea of transition and deliberate strategy away.
Excellent. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what we think is one of the solutions, especially for the West Coast, and that is legalising cannabis and making hemp much more accessible for people to grow. Do you think that, I mean, West Coasters are known for the cannabis use and for being pretty good growers over here, considering the climate and that.
I'm not sure what you mean.
I've got no idea what you're talking about. Do you think that's something that could play a big part? Because the public opinion at the moment is very high. You're looking at 80 to 90% of people in favour of legalisation in some form. One, do you think it's going to play a part in the selection? And two, how do you think that would benefit the West Coast region?
So what I'll give you is a personal view rather than a forest and bird view.
Yeah, of course.
But sort of my personal view, I think, is, you know, I'm pretty strongly on the record as saying that I think that legalisation of cannabis is the correct way to go. Sort of legalised and regulated seems like, to me, an absolute no-brainer on the basis of the evidence. So, you know, personally, that I would love to see that, and love to see that that change. Seems like Canada looks like being the first
July
country.
2018.
Yeah.
Yep.
So there has been, you know, I've been kind of involved in this debate for a long period of time. There has been, I think, in the last couple of years, a really major shift in, I guess, official openness to discussing better options. And a lot of the debate's been around medicinal. I think that is actually a little bit of a red herring. You know, I'm in favour of better access to medicinal cannabis, but as a health sector person, by medicinal cannabis, I'm talking about sort of properly dose titrated and trialed products where we know exactly what the product is. You know, so I'm not saying your doctor gives you a prescription that lets you smoke dope. That's not not what I think of as being medicinal. Although I think actually,
if it's going to work for
if
people,
if you've got a serious or terminal condition, I think, you know, that should be a complete defence against the current law. That would be an easy, quick thing to do. But certainly my personal view is in favour of legalisation rather than decriminalisation, for example. And, you know, potentially for the coast, lots of other areas around the country, that could become a significant crop.
Yeah, especially medicinally, it's a shame because Peter Dunn was recently debating Julianne Genter in Parliament on whether the police will be still arresting people who are terminally ill who are using cannabis products to deal with the side effects of chemotherapy and any other issues they're having. And he said that police will not be cracking down on cancer sufferers. But then this week we see an article in the paper where I think it's a 67-year-old it was a leukemia sufferer, arrested and charged, not sent to prison, but still arrested and charged just for possession. So there was no supply or anything like that. And all he wanted to access was cannabis oil. And before that, he was on the morphine and other very, much to us, we see them as much more powerful and damaging drugs than cannabis is. So clearly there's a lot different. Peter Dunn, Jonathan Coleman as the two people who are standing in the way of access to medicinal cannabis, who are saying that, look, we're going to have this view where people can use it if they need to, yet we're not seeing that in reality, which is why it's so important that we get the legislative change where it is legal and people do have proper access to these medicines.
Yeah, I didn't see that particular case, but what I would say is I think that so Peter Dunn actually, is. I found him to be actually quite good. That his views have changed a lot over the years, and he's interested in doing some good things. His problem is he's part of a government, where he needs to actually produce votes for change, and that National in particular sees its voters as being conservative on the issue. So they think that they stand to lose more votes than gain them. So if I were designing strategy, that's what I would be focused on. I'd be focused on actually getting National Party people to be influencing their MPs on the subject, and Labor as well, because Labor actually will be conservative too. To me, it's a no-brainer. I was on the select committee. We were dealing with a petition that was about Pharmac funding for Sativex. So like this sort of really restricted aspect of the debate, and Pharmac, one of Pharmac's reasons for not agreeing to fund Sativex was its potential for diversion to a recreational market, and that's outside of Pharmac's brief. But the rich irony, it seemed to me, that existed was that Pharmac actually subsidises and funds a whole lot of drugs that are sort of have very well established serious dangers associated with their use that also have a recreational market.
Most definitely.
And so why on earth, if that was a reason to not fund Sativex, why on earth would you be funding, opioids, for example?
Yeah.
So,
or like the Ritalins and those sort of things, they get abused recreationally as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just doesn't make sense, does it? I mean, and that argument doesn't stand because who can afford to pay $1,600 a month for something which you could buy illegally? I mean, people aren't going to try and source out a spray when it's costing that much money unless they absolutely have to.
I think so what we have here, like it's that classic case of what's the relationship between the public policy and evidence, and those of us who are familiar with the evidence would say the evidence is pretty clear on this, that the public policy is all wrong. The problem is that while on the surface we have a public policy making process that is supposed to be about evidence, it is still hidebound in framing that's really from the 1950s. You know, it's in reefer madness and
Alive and well.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically moral panic. You know, still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm interested to hear, on the West Coast, I've heard that it's very similar to Christchurch, and especially regions up in Northland and that, where there's a lot of methamphetamine use destroying communities. Do you know much about their use over here on the West Coast?
Look, I don't know much. I know that it's around and it's having sort of some pretty major sort of damaging effects. You know, I also know that there's a kind of a debate around, okay, to what extent is methamphetamine causing that compared with the people who are using methamphetamine? Would in fact they be having chaotic lives for some other reason? But I probably can't add anything to that debate. Yeah.
No, that's okay, because I've heard in Christchurch that it's easier to access than cannabis, and especially up in Northland.
May well be with this. The year we've had.
So again, to me, it's another tool in the belt in the fight for legalisation of cannabis, for a drug which is much, much less harmful than alcohol, and science has found this time and time again, yet policy does not meet the science, and this is where we need to put this public pressure on.
It was interesting, you know, in the debate around the Psychoactive Substances Act, you know, that what a lot of people were saying is, well, we wouldn't be interested in, you know, these sort of random powders that we can buy at the dairy, you know, if we could actually smoke genuine natural cannabis.
It just makes sense to you and I, but and the Labor government said that they're willing to legalise medicinal cannabis. Greens have said that they want full recreational cannabis. How do you think that would play out if we did get a change in government this year? How do you think that would change the policy?
I mean, I think for both parties, it's a difficult question as to, you know, what would, you know, sort of a new coalition government actually do, because the issue they're facing is they don't know what the balance would be between the two parties in Parliament. So the polls currently are kind of suggesting sort of Labor at sort of typically about twice the size of the Greens in sort of polling support, maybe a little bit more. So does that mean that Labor gets 2/3 of its policies and the Greens get 1/3 of its policies, or does every policy kind of get compromised? You know, so actually working through those systems will be something that they've got to do. I mean, clearly, there will be the numbers there for some sort of medicinal reform, and
that's usually the first start, isn't it? I mean, most countries around the world have started with medicinal and then worked from there.
It is a question of what's meant, though. You know, I'm not a huge fan of the sort of California or kind of the
Colorado,
kind of Vancouver kind of thing where it's. We visited Vancouver a couple of years ago and sort of went into a dispensary and just to see what was there and how the system worked. And they said, "Oh, look, sorry, the doctor isn't on site today. You know, but if you go around to the dispensary around the corner, you know, they'll give you a form. You can sort of tick, you know, back pain, trouble sleeping, whatever. Like it's typical. So it's kind of it's de facto recreational access, and you know, I'd rather sort of not have de facto. I want actual
full,
and
then you can establish a proper market to deal with that access.
And I think, you know, and do medicinal properly as well. You know, so that actually New Zealand is getting, you know, products that are kind of purified. We've extracted the particular chemical or combination of chemicals that has an established therapeutic effect. As I say, I think there is this middle ground of, you know, people who have irreversible, serious or terminal condition, where I think basically you should be able to do pretty much whatever you want. You know, like it's so what purpose is served by not allowing you to do that?
Well, it was like Paul Holmes. I mean, on his last year or so, he was admitted to using medicinal cannabis. I think Russell Crowe also came out and said so. These are high-profile New Zealanders who have admitted they are using it medicinally, and still, you know, it's not considered a medicine until it's, you know, sold in a pharmaceutical bottle for exorbitant profits.
I in sort of in the late 80s, early 90s, I ended up doing 2 stints with the New Zealand AIDS Foundation, but my first one was started in 88. And at that time, we actually had no treatments at all that tackled HIV. Some treatments for some of the opportunistic infections, but nothing that tackled the virus itself. And so there was a really active ethical debate around what were the ethics of a person with AIDS taking a drug that was experimental or that we kind of didn't really know whether this would have an effect or not. And people with AIDS really led the fight for what would term sometimes catastrophic rights at the time. That if you were terminally ill, you should be able to take anything
if it helps,
because it might work. And if it didn't work or if it made things worse, well, how much worse could it really be?
What have you got to lose at that
exactly,
point?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and so I thought a lot about that at the time, and I've sort of been involved in issues around access to medicines and funding medicines ever since. So Paul Callaghan, who was someone that I knew and sort of well-respected New Zealander, sort of led. He was the person who probably kicked off the public enthusiasm for the idea that New Zealand could be predator-free, for example. But he was a physicist. And he died from cancer, and in the last year of his life, he was taking. He experimented with high-dose intravenous vitamin C. Now, I know that the evidence really isn't there for the effectiveness of that, but I was kind of saying, well, why should he be stopped from doing that?
Totally. And even if people say it has a placebo effect, if it's a positive placebo effect, it's still having a good effect.
It's an interesting discussion, so placebo effect is actually quite a substantial effect.
Yeah.
And there's a good literature around how can you maximize the placebo effect, like by making the adherence regime really complicated and big pills and pills of a certain color, and I can't remember if it's capsules or pills that are most effective, but all of those things make the effect larger.
Wow.
To the extent that you get an effect that is often comparable to the sorts of effects that we expect to see from sort of genuinely therapeutic drugs. So let's see, you're getting
the benefit from it.
So it's a very interesting discussion, because the other interesting thing is that it turns out that you get much of the placebo effect even if the person knows that what they're taking is a placebo.
Excellent. I'd also like to talk to you about something which is quite a controversial topic. A lot of our followers are very anti-1080, and as an environmentalist, when I first found out all about 1080 and watched the documentary, I can't remember what it was called, which is very anti-1080, I was myself, and recently I've sort of started coming around that, unfortunately, poison isn't much of a solution, but there's not much else out there. I mean, setting traps is great, but there's so much of New Zealand's native forests which are just inaccessible for trapping. Can you explain a bit more about 1080 and why it's pretty much the only tool we have at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing about 1080 is that it's possible to kind of distribute into backcountry that it's not feasible to control pests through other methods, and it's also far and away the most cost-effective way. There is no doubt that the net effect of 1080 use, assuming that it's kind of applied according to the standards that we've set and the concentrations that we've set and so on, that the net ecological effect is positive. So that it kind of gives birds in particular a break from the predators that allows them to go through some breeding cycles and the numbers increase. The problem with 1080, or the problems with 1080 are that there are sort of non-target animals that may be killed.
Such as, I think it was a few Kia.
Yeah,
which
exactly. So Kia is a good example because they're a really curious bird that they
nibble at
anything. So that's a problem. There, people are looking at sort of parrot repellents. So in the same way that there's the deer repellent is now being used to sort of make the pellets sort of less attractive to Kia. So anyway, you have this problem of sort of by-kill, sort of non-target species being killed, even when there are individuals from the population, from the species that you're trying to protect, even when there are some birds that will be killed from 1080 ingestion directly themselves, the evidence is strong that the ecological effect is still positive, that the benefit from being relieved of the pressure of predators outweighs the individuals that you lose. I guess the other significant sort of by-kill is around where you're using the baits in areas that are close to people, and you end up getting dogs being killed and that sort of thing. Now, all of those effects are sort of becoming less over time. So I used to have an issue with the Animal Health Board here on the West Coast because they would contract with people who would be dropping 1080 in places that were really close to people where people were living, and they were pretty cavalier about where the boundaries were. So people would get it dropped in their gardens and that sort of thing.
You can't have that at all.
Yeah. So that's we're getting a lot less of that. The actual concentration of 1080 that we're using is now way less than it used to be. But kind of as you say, it remains, I wouldn't say the only tool in the toolbox, but an essential tool in the toolbox. One of the reasons that I put effort into resetting traps was that my view was that there were large areas of the country where if resetting traps were viable, you could control pests using resetting traps. Because if you only have to go in to an area once every 6 months, the good nature traps are at that standard now, and they're close to once a year.
And it's all gas that operates it,
So if you only have to do that sort of very infrequently, it means that terrain that is really not practical to be going into every week to actually check traps becomes
more accessible and more
controllable
production.
using traps. So you're effectively extending what front country means.
Yep.
But even with those, there are big areas of the back country, where kind of you still aren't going to be doing it with resetting traps. So you need a combination of methods. I think. I'm really grateful to Dave Hansford for his book on 1080 use, because it does pretty systematically go through all of the reasons.
I definitely need to read that book.
Yeah. And from my point of view, I want I don't like using poisons, but kind of if that's the
net benefit.
Yeah. That's where I end up on the issue, and I think the evidence is strong. What I do see, it's kind of interesting, because my view is, I come across a lot of issues where people's kind of access to information, in inverted commas, so like stuff you can find on the internet, is now massive. Like you can find all sorts of stuff, but people's kind of science skills of being able to interpret that information and sort of balance one study off against another and figure out, kind of what the meta meaning is of all of this information.
Totally agree.
We just don't have it. We still have kids who aren't trained in that kind of science, and I'd love that to be part of the core curriculum in schools. So many issues, vaccinations, fluoride, the science literacy is crucial to being able to advance this. Actually, the freshwater science we were talking about earlier, that we want a population that's able to actually think critically about the scientific principles involved. So I think that's a good thing that Dave's done around 1080 in his book. And it does seem to me that actually the landscape is shifting. I do still get people saying things like, I went into the bush after a 1080 drop, I couldn't hear any birds, therefore 1080 kills birds. So anecdote being used against the evidence. It's not really how science works. And I still get people saying, oh, I remember the old days when there was a bounty on possums, and why can't we go back to that? Well, the reason is, effectively, if a bounty is your system, then the incentive is for people to effectively farm possums.
Oh, okay. So it's not actually addressing the issue.
So you maintain possums to a level that enables you to have a sustainable catch in your traps, rather than to a level that gives you good ecological control.
Very interesting.
And particularly as we move towards eradication, as the goal, trapping for fur, could be part of the solution, but it will be a temporary part of the solution and only a partial part as well.
Is there enough being done around resetting traps in New Zealand at the moment, or is it something which needs a lot more investment?
It would be really interesting to talk to Robbie and the guys from Good Nature about that, actually, because what I've seen is, so when I first came across them, we were looking at, okay, how could you create jobs by getting people to do more trapping? And one of the ideas that we had is that you could actually get them setting, going into the bush and putting in these resetting traps. And at that point, the traps were kind of crude. They didn't have very many kills in them, and you had misfires. Gas canisters were emptying when they shouldn't. But as with any manufactured product, what they've done is they've had this massive quality improvement cycle, and I'm really proud that I was able to be part of that through getting the government to sponsor the big trials.
For sure.
So the product is now kind of way more reliable and effective, and we're getting this massive extension in the sort of the lures being active, and the number of kills that you can get with an individual canister, so that the usefulness of the tool is just sort of light years ahead of where it was at the beginning.
Which is like anything, the more research and development into a certain product, the quicker it's going to advance and develop. Yeah,
and one of the advantages, of course, is that a resetting trap, if it's still got a fresh lure, or a lure that will attract the animal for an extended period of time, well, that can give you a year-round control. So that's actually really effective. As we move towards predator-free, like the idea of trying to eradicate completely, it's got to be a combination of traps, of poisons, potentially of other things. That are still to be developed, but it's an exciting time to be in conservation. Actually,
do you think predator-free is an achievable goal?
Yes, I do. I don't know that was necessarily what was in government's head at the time, but it's interesting because Forest and Bird has had a strategic goal of predator-free in New Zealand since before the government's scheme was announced. And what we did was we invited some sort of top scientists around predator control we've got a lodge on Mount Ruapehu, and invited them there for a seminar. And I wasn't there, but I've heard it described. That species by species, we went around the room asking the expert in that species to say, if money wasn't an object, would it be technically possible to eradicate your species, hedgehogs or weasels or whatever it was, from New Zealand? And one by one, they all said yes. And so, the feeling in the room at that time was,
we can do it.
Hey, the paradigm just shifted, basically, because we're no longer just saying, okay, how do we stop it being as bad as it is now, to instead we can make this way better. We can eradicate rather than control, which means you've shifted it from a permanent problem to a time-limited problem. And it changes the kinds of things you have to think about. So if you're just thinking about control, all you're thinking about is how do we suppress the numbers. But if you have to do eradication, then you have to have a technique that will get that last pregnant female who might be bait shy, or so it's got us thinking about different scientific questions. Now, when government announced its policy of predator-free 2050 and put its $28 million in, I'm not sure that they particularly thought through all of this.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
But what's happened, the really great thing that's happened subsequently is that it has got now big community groups thinking, okay, so how would we do that in our area, and so people have moved from thinking about, a particular reserve in which they do trapping to control possums and rats, through to, okay, in this whole landscape, the top of the South Island or the greater Wellington area, how do we go about eradicating predators in this space? And it's led to lots of groups working together that haven't been until now. So I think there's a lot of really exciting things happening.
That's really great to hear. Thank you very much for sitting down and having a chat with me, Kevin. I really appreciate it. And all the best with all the work with Forest and Bird. You guys are doing amazing work out there. And let's hopefully get a change in government this year and start really get these issues addressed.
Well, it's whoever is in the government, we need the issues addressed.
Agreed.
So we'll be working with all political parties to try and achieve positive change.
Good to hear, mate. Good to hear. Thank you.
Thank you.